Stephen Callahan heard the bang before he felt it. A deafening crash in the middle of the night, somewhere deep in the hull of his sailboat. Then the boat lurched violently to the side and water started pouring in. It was February 4th, 1982, and Stephen was about 450 miles west of the Canary Islands, alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was 29 years old, and in the next 5 minutes, everything he owned was going to sink to the bottom of the sea. Stephen had built the Napoleon Solo himself, a 21-foot sloop, sleek and beautiful, designed for solo ocean crossings. He'd left Newport, Rhode Island in 1981 with a dream: sail across the Atlantic, race in the Mini Transat 650 competition, and prove he could handle the ocean alone. The first crossing went fine. He made it to Europe, but bad weather forced him to drop out of the race in Spain. After repairs, he'd sailed south to the Canary Islands and set out again on January 29, 1982, heading for Antigua in the Caribbean. 3,000 miles, alone, just him and the ocean. The first week had been perfect. Smooth tradewind sailing, clear skies, calm seas. Stephen was in his element. He'd been sailing since he was a kid, growing up in Connecticut, obsessed with the ocean. By the time he was in his 20s, he was living on boats, working as a naval architect, designing vessels for other sailors. The Napoleon Solo was his masterpiece. He built watertight compartments into the hull, thinking it would keep the boat afloat if something went wrong. But here's what Stephen didn't know. The watertight compartments wouldn't matter if a whale hit you at full speed. That's what Stephen thinks happened. In his book, he writes that the collision felt like something massive, probably a whale, maybe a shark, smashed into the boat with the force of a freight train. The hull cracked, water flooded in. Stephen tried to bail it out, working frantically in the dark. But the ocean was faster. Within minutes, the boat was sinking. Stephen grabbed his emergency kit, threw his 6-foot Avon inflatable life raft overboard, and dove back into the flooding cabin 3 times to retrieve anything he could. He got a sleeping bag, a piece of foam cushion, the emergency survival kit, a spear gun, some flares, a flashlight, navigation charts, and this is the thing that would save his life: 3 solar stills for making drinking water, and a survival manual written by Dougal Robertson, who had survived 38 days adrift in 1972. Stephen climbed into the life raft just as a massive wave broke over the Napoleon Solo and ripped the raft away. Stephen watched his boat, his home, his dream, disappear into the darkness. And then he was alone, completely, utterly alone, drifting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on a raft barely bigger than a bathtub. The life raft was designed for 6 people. Stephen was the only one in it. It had a small canopy for shade, but no motor, no oars, no way to steer. He was at the mercy of the currents and the wind. The south equatorial current carried him west, toward the Caribbean, 1,800 miles away. At an average drift speed of about 1 knot, it would take months to reach land. If he reached land at all, Stephen took stock of what he had. The emergency kit contained some canned food, maybe a week's worth if he rationed it carefully. A few pints of water. The solar stills, which were supposed to desalinate seawater. But Stephen had never used them before and didn't have instructions. The spear gun had 3 spear tips. The flares were waterproof. The navigation charts were soaked but still readable. And the survival manual, Stephen read that book cover to cover in the first 2 days. It became his Bible. But wait, here's where the real nightmare began. On day 3, Stephen realized the solar stills didn't work the way he thought they did. They were World War II-era prototypes, and without instructions, he couldn't figure out how to assemble them. So he took one apart, destroyed it completely, and reverse-engineered how it worked. It took him hours. When he finally got the other 2 stills working, they produced maybe a pint of water a day, combined. On a good day, Stephen needed at least a quart just to survive. He was already dehydrated. The food ran out after 10 days. Stephen had eaten everything in the emergency kit: canned beans, crackers, a few energy bars. Now he had to hunt. The spear gun became his lifeline. Dorado mahi-mahi fish had started following the raft. They were attracted to the barnacles that grew on the bottom of it, and to Stephen himself. He called them his doggies. Every day Stephen would lean over the edge of the raft, wait for a dorado to swim close and spear it. Sometimes he missed. Sometimes the fish snapped the spear and swam away. But when he hit one, he'd haul it into the raft, gut it with a knife, and eat it raw. The flesh was rubbery and salty, but it kept him alive. Flying fish would land on the raft at night, attracted by the light of the moon. Stephen would wake up in the morning and find them flopping around. He ate those too. He ate barnacles scraped off the bottom of the raft. He even ate a bird once, a small seabird that landed on the canopy exhausted. Stephen grabbed it, wrung its neck and ate it, bones and all. But here's what nobody tells you about survival at sea. The hunger isn't the worst part, it's the thirst. Stephen was surrounded by water, endless, infinite water, and he couldn't drink any of it. Seawater would kill him faster than dehydration. The solar stills barely worked. Rain was unpredictable. Stephen rigged improvised water collection systems, using pieces of the raft's canopy, funneling rainwater into containers. On days when it rained, he'd catch maybe half a pint. On days when it didn't, he had nothing. His lips cracked and bled, his tongue swelled, his throat felt like sandpaper. He was slowly dying of thirst in the middle of an ocean. Now pay attention to this part, because this is where Stephen's mind started to fracture. Around day 20, he started talking to himself, out loud, full conversation. He created different personalities, different versions of himself, to keep from going insane. One voice was logical and calm, calculating distances and rations. Another voice was angry, cursing the ocean and the whale and his own bad luck. A third voice was terrified, whispering that he was going to die out here and no one would ever find him. Stephen knew he was hallucinating, but he couldn't stop. The loneliness was crushing. He was the only human being for hundreds of miles in every direction. The raft started breaking down. Dorado, with their sharp beaks, kept puncturing holes in the inflatable tubes. Stephen would wake up in the morning to find the raft half deflated, sinking into the water. He'd have to pump it back up by hand, 300 strokes with a manual pump, multiple times a day. His arms ached, his hands blistered. The pump broke on day 40. Stephen had to repair it using pieces of the spear gun and duct tape from the survival kit. If the raft deflated completely, he was dead. Sharks circled constantly. Stephen could see them in the water, dark shapes gliding beneath the raft. Sometimes they'd bump it, testing to see if it was food. Stephen would slap the water with his hand, trying to scare them away. It didn't always work. One shark bit the raft, tearing a gash in the fabric. Stephen patched it with a repair kit he'd salvaged, but the patch leaked. He was constantly pumping, constantly repairing, constantly fighting to stay afloat. The physical deterioration was brutal. Stephen lost a third of his body weight, dropping from 160 pounds to barely 100. His ribs stuck out, his face hollowed. His skin was covered in saltwater sores, painful, open wounds that wouldn't heal because he was always wet. He developed infections. His hands were cracked and bleeding from handling fish and ropes. He was weak, dizzy, constantly on the edge of collapse. But he refused to quit. Every morning he'd wake up, check his position, using a makeshift sextant he'd built from pencils, spear a fish, pump the raft, and survive another day. Stephen saw 9 ships during those 76 days. 9 chances to be rescued. He fired flares. He waved his arms. He screamed until his voice gave out. But none of them saw him. The raft was too small. The ocean was too big. The ships passed him by, disappearing over the horizon, and Stephen was left alone again. After the 3rd ship, he stopped hoping for rescue. He realized the truth: no one was coming. If he was going to survive, it would be on his own. But the truly shocking part, Stephen didn't hate the ocean, even after everything it did to him, the whale, the thirst, the sharks, the loneliness, he still loved it. He wrote in his journal about the beauty of the night sky, a view of heaven from a seat in hell, he called it. The stars were so bright they looked fake. The ocean glowed with bioluminescence. Dolphins swam alongside the raft sometimes, and Stephen would talk to them like they were friends. The ocean was killing him, but it was also keeping him alive. The fish, the rain, the currents carrying him west. It was his enemy and his home. On day 75, Stephen spotted lights on the horizon. The island of Marie Galante, southeast of Guadeloupe. He was so close, but the currents were pulling him past it. Stephen tried everything, rigging a makeshift sail from the raft's canopy, paddling with his hands, but it wasn't enough. He was going to drift past the island and back into the open ocean. For the first time in 76 days, Stephen thought about giving up. He was exhausted, starving, delirious. What was the point? But on the morning of April 21, 1982, day 76, a group of fishermen spotted something strange: birds. Dozens of them, circling in one spot in the water. The fishermen knew what that meant. Something was attracting the birds. Food, maybe a dead whale. They motored over to investigate. And there, floating in the middle of the ocean, was Stephen Callahan, barely conscious, skeleton covered in sores, but alive. The fishermen pulled him onto their boat. Stephen tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work. He hadn't used them in 76 days. They carried him to shore, wrapped him in blankets, and took him to a hospital on Marie Galante. Doctors said he was one of the worst cases of prolonged dehydration and starvation they'd ever seen. Stephen spent 6 weeks recovering. He gained back the weight slowly. The sores healed, but the psychological scars took longer. Stephen returned to Maine and tried to process what had happened. He'd survived 76 days alone on the Atlantic Ocean, longer than anyone on record at that time. He'd drifted 1,800 miles, he'd speared fish, collected rainwater, fought off sharks, and rebuilt his raft a dozen times. He'd done the impossible, but why? What was the point of all that suffering? Stephen found the answer by writing. In 1986, he published Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea. The book was a bestseller, spending 36 weeks on the New York Times list. It wasn't just a survival story, it was a meditation on loneliness, resilience, fear, and the human will to live. Stephen wrote about the dorado he killed, the sharks he fought, the ships that passed him by. But he also wrote about gratitude, about beauty, about learning to appreciate life in a way most people never do. Years later, director Ang Lee called Stephen and asked him to consult on the film Life of Pi. The movie's protagonist spends months adrift on a life raft with a tiger. Ang Lee wanted to make the ocean a real character, and Stephen was the only person who could teach him how. Stephen spent months helping design the raft, the fishing tools, the survival techniques, and when the movie came out in 2012, millions of people saw a version of Stephen's story on the big screen. Today, Stephen is in his 70s, he still sails, he still loves the ocean. He's designed new life rafts, based on his experience. Rafts that don't just float, but sail, giving survivors a chance to navigate toward land instead of drifting helplessly. He's invented dozens of marine safety devices. He's written books, he's given speeches, and he's survived cancer, a stem cell transplant, and the removal of both kidneys. "I had my 30th birthday in a life raft," Stephen once said, "and spent my 60th birthday in a hospital bed, getting chemotherapy." But Stephen has no regrets. "Anything worth doing is not going to be easy," he says. "I still don't regret my 76 days alone in the raft. To this day, I feel enlightened by what I went through, because it changed me for the better." Stephen Callahan's story isn't just about surviving. It's about what happens when you're stripped of everything: your boat, your food, your safety, your connection to the world, and all you have left is yourself. And in that loneliness, in that suffering, Stephen found something most people never find: a reason to keep going. Not because rescue was coming, but because life, even at its worst, is still worth living.